In the dim glow of a flickering lantern deep within a German trench on the Western Front in 1917, a young soldier named Hans clutched his rifle, his breath visible in the cold night air. The whispers among his comrades were hushed, but urgent. The Canadians are coming. It wasn't just any Allied force they feared. It was the men from the vast, untamed lands across the Atlantic. These weren't the polished British regulars or the fresh-faced Americans who would join later. No, these were Canadians, hardy souls forged in the wilderness, descendants of pioneers who wrestled with blizzards and bears. And on that fateful day at Vimy Ridge, they would etch their name into the annals of terror for the German army. To understand why the Germans came to dread the Canadian infantry above all others, we must journey back to the Great War, World War I, where the seeds of this fearsome reputation were sown. Canada, a young dominion still tied to the British Empire, entered the conflict with enthusiasm but little expectation. Yet, by 1915, the Canadian Expeditionary Force had grown into a formidable corps of 4 divisions, comprising over 100,000 men. These soldiers weren't professional warriors. Many were farmers from the prairies, lumberjacks from the forests of Ontario and Quebec, miners from the Rockies, and fishermen from the Maritimes. They brought with them a rugged individualism, a no-nonsense grit honed by harsh winters and endless frontiers. Unlike the British troops, who often adhered to rigid hierarchies and traditional tactics, or the Americans who would later emphasize overwhelming firepower, Canadians adapted quickly, innovating in the mud and blood of the trenches. The turning point came in April 1917 at Vimy Ridge, a heavily fortified German position in northern France that had repelled multiple Allied assaults. The British and French had tried and failed, losing tens of thousands in futile charges. But the Canadians, under the command of General Arthur Currie, a former real estate agent turned military genius, approached it differently. They trained meticulously, using scale models of the battlefield and rehearsing every move. They employed creeping barges, where artillery fire advanced just ahead of the infantry, and they pioneered underground tunneling to plant massive mines beneath enemy lines. When the assault began on Easter Monday, amid sleet and snow, the Canadians stormed the ridge with a ferocity that stunned the Germans. Hans, our imagined German soldier, would have heard the earth-shaking explosions as 19 massive mines detonated, crumbling fortifications and burying defenders alive. Then came the waves of khaki-clad figures, bayonets fixed, advancing through the smoke. The Canadians didn't just charge. They fought with a primal intensity. Stories from survivors spoke of soldiers who, when ammunition ran low, resorted to clubs, shovels, and even bare hands. One German prisoner later recounted, "They came at us like wolves, silent and unrelenting. No mercy in their eyes." By the end of the 4-day battle, the Canadians had captured the ridge, taking 4,000 prisoners and inflicting heavy casualties, all at a cost of 3,598 killed and 7,004 wounded. It was a victory that unified Canada as a nation, but for the Germans, it marked the Canadians as stormtroopers, elite shock troops to be feared. This reputation spread like wildfire through the German ranks. Propaganda leaflets warned of the Canadier, depicting them as savage barbarians. In the Battle of Passchendaele later that year, Canadians again proved their mettle, slogging through knee-deep mud to capture a village that had become a symbol of futility. They succeeded where others faltered, but at a horrific price: 16,000 casualties. German commanders noted in their reports that Canadian units were exceptionally aggressive, often pushing beyond objectives and disrupting supply lines with daring raids. Unlike the British, who sometimes negotiated truces or showed restraint, Canadians were seen as unpredictable, willing to fight to the last man. As World War I drew to a close, the 100 Days Offensive in 1918 saw the Canadian Corps spearhead the Allied advance, breaking through the Hindenburg Line and capturing more territory, prisoners, and guns than any other formation. General Currie's men covered 86 miles in 100 days, a feat that earned them the moniker the spearhead of victory. But this success came with a dark undercurrent. Rumors circulated that Canadians rarely took prisoners, especially after witnessing atrocities against their own. In one infamous incident at the Second Battle of Ypres in 1915, when Germans first used poison gas, killing thousands, including many Canadians, it hardened their resolve. No quarter given, no quarter asked, became an unspoken creed. By the war's end, the Germans had a specific dread for the maple leaf insignia. Captured documents revealed orders to hold positions at all costs against Canadian attacks, and some units were instructed to execute Canadian prisoners in retaliation, a policy that only fueled the cycle of brutality. This wasn't mere myth. Historians like Tim Cook in his book Shock Troops detail how the Canadians' effectiveness and ruthlessness made them targets. In contrast, British troops were viewed as steadfast but conventional, relying on artillery and numbers. Americans, entering late in 1917, were enthusiastic but inexperienced, often charging headlong without the same tactical finesse. Fast forward to the interwar years, and this legacy lingered. In Canada, veterans returned to quiet lives, but their stories were passed down in Legion halls and family gatherings. For those of us in our golden years, perhaps you remember a grandfather or uncle sharing tales over a cup of Tim Hortons coffee, his eyes distant as he recalled the mud of Flanders. These men weren't glory seekers. They were ordinary Canadians who rose to extraordinary challenges. But as the shadows of another war loomed in the 1930s, the world wondered, would the Canadians of World War II live up to, or surpass, their predecessors' fearsome name? In the quiet farms of Saskatchewan and the bustling ports of Halifax, a new generation prepared. When Canada declared war on Germany in September 1939, just days after Britain, it was with a sense of duty born from history. The Canadian Army mobilized slowly at first, but by 1940, divisions were training in England, refining the lessons of Vimy. Little did they know that in the fields of Normandy and the hills of Italy, they would reignite the German fear, proving once more why the swastika-wearing soldiers whispered warnings about the devils from the north. As the first shots of World War II echoed across Europe, the stage was set for a new chapter in this saga of valor and dread. But what specific battles would cement this terror? And why did the Germans single out Canadians over their Allied counterparts? The answers lie in the blood-soaked sands of Dieppe and the hedgerows of Caen. Stories that will make your heart swell with pride and your spine tingle with the raw truth of war. Stay with me, dear reader, for the tale is just beginning to unfold. The morning of August 19th, 1942 broke gray and cold over the English Channel. On the pebble beach of Dieppe, France, the first pale light revealed a scene that would haunt the German defenders for the rest of the war. Thousands of men in khaki were scrambling from landing craft under a storm of machine gun fire, and the shoulder flashes on their battle dress read Canada. For 9 brutal hours, the 2nd Canadian Division, along with a handful of British commandos and a small American Ranger detachment, fought and bled on those stones. Nearly 60% of the Canadians who landed that day became casualties. 916 dead, 1,946 taken prisoner, hundreds more wounded. To the world outside, Dieppe was a disaster, a costly raid that taught hard lessons for D-Day 2 years later. But inside the Atlantic Wall, something very different was whispered from bunker to bunker. Die Canadier sind wieder da. The Canadians are back. German coastal troops had expected another timid probe, perhaps a British commando hit and run. Instead, they faced men who, even when the plan collapsed within minutes, kept coming. Tanks bogged down on the shingle, radios failed, naval support fell short, yet small groups of Essex Scottish, Royal Hamilton Light Infantry, Fusiliers Montroyal, and Cavalry Regiment soldiers pushed into the town itself, house by house, street by street. A German officer from the 571st Infantry Regiment later wrote in his diary, "They fought like madmen. Even when surrounded and out of ammunition, they used bayonets, fists, and rocks. We had to kill them to the last man in some cellars." Prisoners taken that morning told their interrogators the same thing. The Canadians had been told this was a rehearsal, not the real invasion, yet they fought as though the fate of the world depended on it. Word of Dieppe spread rapidly up the chain of command. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding all German forces in the West, received a report that ended with a chilling sentence. Against Canadians, normal defensive measures are insufficient. Special preparations will be required. 2 years later, when the real invasion came on June 6, 1944, the Canadians landed on Juno Beach, the second bloodiest sector after Omaha. While the British struggled on Gold and Sword and the Americans bled at Omaha, the Canadians, 3rd Division, reinforced by the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade, pushed farther inland on D-Day than any other Allied formation. By nightfall, they were 6 miles deep, almost linking up with the British on their left. German radio traffic that evening was frantic. Achtung! Kanadische Truppen dringen schnell vor. Attention! Canadian troops advancing rapidly. The men who terrified the 716th Static Division and the battle-hardened 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, were, once again, ordinary Canadians. Farmers from the Annapolis Valley, mill workers from Trois-Varese, prairie boys who had never seen salt water until they shipped out. But they had trained for 3 long years in Britain, and they fought with a cold, methodical fury that the Germans had not seen from other Commonwealth troops. They moved fast, they used their weapons with skill, and, most unsettling of all, they rarely showed the hesitation that young soldiers usually display when bullets snap past their ears for the first time. In the weeks that followed, as the Allies battled through the bocage country of Normandy, the German High Command began shifting units specifically to block Canadian advances. The 1st SS Panzer Corps, containing the cream of the Waffen-SS, was rushed from the British sector to face the Canadians around Caen. Why? Because Field Marshal Rommel's staff had noticed a pattern. Wherever the maple leaf appeared on situation maps, German positions cracked faster and more completely than elsewhere. The battle for Caen in July 1944 was a meat grinder. Operation Goodwood, the British armored thrust, stalled bloodily. But when the Canadians launched Operation Atlantic and then Totalize, something different happened. The 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions, supported by the 1st Polish Armored Division and massive bomber strikes, smashed through lines that the Germans had held for weeks. Kap'yong Airfield, taken after hand-to-hand fighting by the North Nova Scotia Highlanders and the Highland Light Infantry of Canada, became a graveyard of knocked-out Panthers and Tigers. A captured German medical officer from the 12th SS told his interrogator, "Your Canadians do not stop. Even when we think we have them, they come again at night. They crawl through the wheat like Red Indians." That phrase, like Red Indians, appears again and again in German accounts. The Canadians had perfected the art of night infiltration. Small groups, often led by First Nations soldiers whose tracking skills were legendary, would slip through the darkness, cut phone lines, knife sentries, and open gaps for the main assault. The Black Watch of Canada, the Maisonneuve Regiment, the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders. These units became ghosts in the Norman orchards. German soldiers began to dread the hours after sunset. When ES Dunkel word, "Common die Canadier," they said. When it gets dark, the Canadians come. By August, the Falaise Pocket was closing. 20 German divisions were trapped, and it was the Canadians and Poles pushing from the north who slammed the door. The road from Trun to Chambois became known as the Corridor of Death. Over 10,000 German soldiers died there, another 50,000 surrendered. A young lieutenant from the 9th SS Panzer Division, captured by the South Saskatchewan Regiment, asked his captor in broken English, "Why do you Canadians fight like this? You have no cities burning, no homes destroyed yet. Why such hate?" The Canadian private, cigarette dangling from his lip, answered simply, "We remember Dieppe, lad. And we remember Hong Kong." Ah yes, Hong Kong. Christmas 1941. The Royal Rifles of Canada and the Winnipeg Grenadiers, 2 understrength battalions sent to bolster the colony, fought against overwhelming Japanese odds. After savage hand-to-hand combat in the hills, they were forced to surrender. What followed? Years of starvation, torture, and slave labor in Japanese camps scarred an entire generation of Canadian soldiers. When those stories filtered back home, They hardened hearts across the country. Men who might have fought with restraint now carried a cold rage, especially against any Axis soldier who wore a different kind of rising sun or swastika. As the campaign moved into northwest Europe, through the flooded polders of the Scheldt estuary, the mud of the Hochwald Gap, the streets of Groningen, the pattern held. German commanders issued standing orders. If Canadian units are identified opposite your sector, expect night attacks, expect no preliminary bombardment before an assault, expect prisoners to be few. In the Reichswald in February 1945, the 2nd Canadian Corps fought alongside the British in Operation Veritable. British units advanced steadily. The Canadians leapt forward in bounds that left German staff officers staring at their maps in disbelief. One final anecdote from those dark months. In April 1945, as the war staggered to its end, a convoy of German prisoners was being marched back through Canadian lines. An older Feldwebel, seeing the maple leaf patches, turned to a young Argyll and Sutherland Highlander guarding him and said in perfect English, "You know, we were always told the Tommies fight fair and the Americans fight rich. But you Canadians, you just fight." The young Argyll, barely 20, looked at the exhausted German and replied, "That's because we're a long way from home, Jerry, and we intend to get back there." The war in Europe ended a month later. Canadian soldiers, many wearing the feared red shoulder patch, helped liberate Holland, where they are still remembered with tulips and tears every May. But the question remains, why them? Why did the Canadians, out of all the Allied armies, inspire that special dread in the German soldier? Was it training? Was it leadership? Was it simply the vast, empty country that bred a certain toughness? The answer lies waiting in the final chapter, on the wind-swept ridges of Korea, in the dusty valleys of Afghanistan, and in the quiet pride that still burns in Legion halls from St. John's to Victoria. Because the story did not end in 1945. The reputation followed the maple leaf into new wars, and the fear, though the enemy now wore different uniforms, remained the same. Hold fast, my friends. The last pieces of this puzzle, the ones that will make the hair on the back of your neck stand up, are coming next. The guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, but the whisper did not die. In the shattered barracks of prisoner-of-war camps, in the hushed conversations of Wehrmacht veterans who met in Munich beer halls 20 years later, one name still made old men lower their voices: Canada. They did not speak of Montgomery's British with awe, nor of Patton's Americans with hatred. They spoke of the Canadians the way sailors once spoke of the Bermuda Triangle, something outside the normal rules of war, something that came quietly and left nothing behind. That reputation did not fade with the peace. It followed the maple leaf into the coldest corners of the next war. October 1950. A freezing rain lashes Hill 355 in Korea, a windswept hump the soldiers call Little Gibraltar. The Chinese People's Volunteer Army, 200,000 strong, has just smashed across the 38th parallel. American and British units reel backward. In the path of the human wave assaults stands the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, barely 700 men, holding a ridge the United Nations cannot afford to lose. For 3 nights, the Chinese threw regiment after regiment at the Patricius. Bugles sounded, whistles shrilled. Thousands charged uphill into Canadian Bren guns and carefully hoarded artillery. When the ammunition was almost gone, the Canadians fixed bayonets and waited in the dark. On the morning of November 24th, the Chinese finally broke and ran. 10,000 of them lay dead or dying on the slopes. The Patricius lost 15 killed. A captured Chinese officer, asked why his division had failed where others had overrun UN positions, answered through a translator, "We were told the ridge was held by Canadians." My men remembered stories from their fathers who fought the Germans. They said the same thing. When a maple leaf is seen, the attack fails. The Chinese had no reason to know Canadian history, yet the legend had traveled, from German prisoners in 1945 to Soviet advisors in 1946 to North Korean and Chinese training camps by 1950. The Canadians, it was said, did not retreat, did not panic, and did not take many prisoners when they were angry. The story had grown in the telling, but it was rooted in truth. Jump forward another 50 years. Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, 2006. A young Taliban commander named Mullah Abdullah gives an interview to Al Jazeera. The reporter asks why his fighters feared night operations against certain NATO units. Abdullah laughs nervously and says, "Everyone knows the dangerous ones wear a little red flag on their shoulder. They move like ghosts. When we hear Canadian voices on the radio, we tell our men to dig deeper or run." The soldiers he feared were boys from Regina, Gander, and Shawinigan, members of the 1st Battalion, Royal Canadian Regiment Battle Group, and the Princess Patricius again, who, in the heat of the WWII, fought the same way their grandfathers had at Vimy and Caen, aggressively at night, in small teams that seemed to be everywhere at once. Operation Medusa in September 2006 saw 1,400 Canadians and their Afghan allies smash a Taliban force 3 times their size. When it was over, the Taliban called the Arghandab River Valley the place where Canadians eat men. Why? Why always them? The answer is not one battle, nor one war, but a thread that runs clean through our history. First, the land itself. Canada is vast and unforgiving. A boy who grows up splitting firewood at -40 or guiding a fishing boat through North Atlantic storms learns early that hesitation kills. That same boy, handed a Lee Enfield or AC-7, brings that lesson to war. Second, leadership. From Curry to Curry, Arthur in 1917, David in Afghanistan. Canadian generals have almost always been given independence that British or American commanders rarely enjoyed. They are told the objective and left to get on with it. That freedom breeds initiative all the way down to the private soldier. Third, the volunteer spirit. In both World Wars and Korea, the Canadian Army was almost entirely volunteer. Men who fought under the maple leaf chose to be there. They were not conscripts counting days until discharge. They were citizens who crossed an ocean because they believed something was worth killing and dying for. That belief, when it turns cold and hard, is a terrifying thing to face across a battlefield. Fourth, memory. Canadians do not forget friends who were murdered after surrender. From the crucifixion of prisoners at Ypres in 1915 to the execution of captured Canadian medics by the 12th SS in Normandy to the beheading of prisoners in Hong Kong and later in Afghanistan. The stories are told and retold in every mess, every armory, every Legion Hall. The message is simple. We will come for you, and we will not stop. And finally, the quiet ones. The First Nations soldiers, Tommy Prince in Korea, the snipers of the Devil's Brigade in Italy, the scouts who walked point through Normandy orchards, brought skills that became legend. The Germans called them Waldteufel, forest devils. They moved without sound, saw without being seen, and when they appear behind your lines, you are already dead. All of this combined to create something greater than the sum of its parts, a reputation that did the fighting before the first shot was fired. German machine gunners in 1944, Chinese infantry in 1951, Taliban spotters in 2008. They all hesitated for one fatal second when they saw that small red flag. And in that second, a Bren gun or a C9 opened up, a bayonet flashed, a javelin missile streaked out of the darkness. Tonight, somewhere in a Legion branch, an old soldier in a blazer 2 sizes too big raises a glass of Moosehead or a double rye. He doesn't talk much about what he did, but if you buy him another, he might lean in and tell you about a ridge in France, or a hill in Korea, or a grape-drying hut in Jury District where the night smelled of dust and cordite and fear that wasn't his. He will tell you the same thing the German lieutenant told the Argyll private in 1945. We just fight. And that, my friends, is why they were afraid. Not because we were cruel, though sometimes we were. Not because we were invincible, because far too many never came home. But because when ordinary Canadians, your fathers, your uncles, maybe even you, put on that uniform and stepped into the dark, they carried with them the same stubborn refusal to quit that built this country out of rock and ice. The enemy learned it the hard way, and they never forgot, lest we forget. You're sitting in your living room tonight, maybe with a cup of tea cooling beside your chair, the television flickering with some forgettable program. Outside, The snow is falling soft and steady across the fields of New Brunswick or the streets of Winnipeg, the same kind of snow that drifted over Vimy Ridge in April 1917 and over Hill 355 in November 1952. And somewhere in the quiet of your house, an old regimental tie hangs in a closet, or a framed photograph of a young man in battle dress sits on the mantelpiece. You know the face. You know the story he never quite told all the way through. That young man, and millions like him, gave the German soldier, the Chinese soldier, the Taliban fighter, a nightmare that lasted long after the shooting stopped. They never feared the British Empire at its grandest parade, nor the American juggernaut with its endless rivers of tanks and bombers. They feared a quiet people from a quiet country who, when pushed too far, simply refused to step back. Tonight, across this land, the last of the World War II boys are slipping away. The Korea veterans are already few. Soon the Legion halls will have more empty chairs than filled ones. But the story does not die with them. It lives in you. Every time a young Canadian soldier today puts on the uniform and boards a plane for Latvia or Kuwait or wherever duty calls next, the old ghost walks with him. The enemy may not know the names Vimy, Caen, Kap'yong, or Medusa, but something in the back of his mind still whispers, "Careful." Those are the ones who do not stop. And that, my friends, is the final piece. We were never the biggest army. We were never the richest. We were never the loudest. But when the line had to hold, when the night was darkest, when the cause looked lost, someone, somewhere, always said the same thing. Send the Canadians. They sent them in 1915, and the ridge was taken. They sent them in 1944, and the road to Falaise was closed. They sent them in 1951, and the hill stood firm. They sent them in 2006, and the Taliban ran. And every time, ordinary men from small towns and big cities, from farms and fishing boats and factory floors, did what needed doing and came home quiet. So tonight, if you're one of the old soldiers still with us, lift your glass one more time. If you're the son or daughter, the grandson or granddaughter, lift it for him. Because the fear is gone from the enemy now. Most of them are dust. But the pride, the fierce, humble pride, belongs to us forever. We know why they were afraid, and we know why they were right to be. Lest we forget. Per ardua, abique, and always, always, Canada.